today's this afternoon session is themed digital support and troubleshooting. And we, through this session, we're hoping that our young women and girls who've joined the session will learn about the different parts that are found within a computer, and possibly grow an interest in learning how to fix computers, and possibly develop that interest and venture into a career that is support or troubleshooting and support. So today's session outcomes are that we're going to explore how to stay safe when working with hardware components. We think it's important that we go through this element so that you do not damage any of the parts as you try to possibly play around with the different parts that you're going to see today. We're also going to be looking at the different hardware parts that are found within a computer, and then we're going to identify them within a what we call a tower or a computer box. Right, so let's get right into it. The first item is the importance of making sure that when you are going to work on a computer, especially with the hardware components, and when you are trying to fix a computer, it's important that you make sure that the system is unplugged and that there is no power that's distributed to any of the parts within the system. We all know that if you do work on this, you may just get shocked. The other element is that you need to ground yourself before working on any components, because the components, if they get any sort of static shock on the metal bits, then that element can damage the entire part that you are trying to work with. So it's important that you ground. Normally, we use grounding strips or a grounding mat. If you don't have that, it's important that you just you ground yourself by touching a metal part in the area that you're going to work in. And the other thing is that we don't advise that any of us works on a power supply. So we wouldn't like any of us to just work or open a power supply, because it carries quite a high voltage of power, and it keeps power within it. So even when you've plugged it off, sometimes the power remains within the power supply, and if you're going to try and work on it and you're not skilled enough, then it becomes a bit of a problem. The other thing is that when you're working with the different parts or the different components of a computer, it is important that you just touch the plastic parts of the cards that you will be working with. So you don't touch any of the metal parts, so the metal wires that are found on the different components. Rather, if you're going to work on it, touch the plastic parts so that you don't damage any of the metal wires. It's also key that you keep any sort of food away from the space that you're going to be using. Also, there's a kit that is made for keeping all the small components of the computer as you work on it. So it's advised that you have that kit, and it's got a small little tube where you can put in all your screws, so that as you unscrew and screw back, you don't lose any of the different parts. And lastly, when you're working on a computer or the internal bits of a computer, it's important that you don't force any part into position. So the trick is that each part has got some form of indication on it that will tell you or show you this is how a part should be clicked in. And the only way you know that the part is correctly inserted is if you hear the click. But if there's no click and you keep on forcing, you will bend the pins, you will scratch and damage any of the wire features on it. So it's important that we don't force any device onto the motherboard that we're going to be working with. So what is hardware? So when we're talking about hardware in ICT, we're talking about all the physical parts that you are able to see, be it internally inside the computer box or externally, what we refer to as peripherals, so that will be your mouse, your keyboard, and all those elements that we use externally, and everything else that's inside a computer is also considered a hardware. Now that will include your floppy disk drive, your CPU, your hard drive, your motherboard. All those parts that you are able to see, touch, and feel are then called the hardware of a computer system, right? The first part that we're going to be looking at is the motherboard. And the reason why we're looking at that as the first part is because everything that's in the computer, or anything that functions within a computer, is stationed on the motherboard. So it may not be physically stationed, as in, let me just quickly try to get a pointer quickly. So some of the parts, like you will see here, where the CPU resides, will be stationed or rather the central processing unit will be stationed inside or on the motherboard. But everything that needs to communicate with the computer is in one way or another connected to the motherboard, because the motherboard becomes it powers everything basically that's on a system. And if anything is connected to a system and is not connected to the motherboard, then there's no communication to any part. And the motherboard then carries the system bus on it. So all forms of communication from the different parts, from what you input to the different parts, is carried through the motherboard. So it then becomes the center of how a computer generally functions. The second thing that we look at is the processor, which is also called the CPU. The reason why we have it as the second part is that it centers, it's the main part that communicates with the different parts of the computer. It's normally situated very close to the RAM, which is the memory of the computer, because then the RAM receives the communication faster, and then the CPU is able to respond faster. And this is why when you type in something, almost immediately things start happening. And it's because the power sits within the CPU and it drives communication using the motherboard. The other element that we want to look at is the memory. The memory, as we indicated, normally sits very closely to the CPU, but the main function of the memory is that it carries within it some storage space. So when you, for instance, send through an instruction from your keyboard, it will sit on the memory before it gets moved onto the hard drive. And it sits there so that it's very easy to access, and it's very quick as well to access. So it works very closely to the CPU and the hard drive as a one piece that transfers data and informations in a form of zeros and ones to the different parts, but in a quicker way than you would receive the information from a hard drive. Then we look at the hard drive, which is the primary storage of any computing device. For the longest of time, I must say, it had been. We know that the story now is that there's cloud computing, and there's a lot of storage that happens within that space. However, the hard drive still remains the primary, because it sits within your system, and anything and everything that you wish to store that is not necessarily online then is stored onto your computer box. Right. Within a computer box, we have what we call expansion bays. These bays we normally see right under your CD-ROM or your DVD-ROM. You will see that there will be a slot nyana at the bottom, but it will be empty. It won't have anything. But when you see a system that has that, it's just an indication that within the system you are able to add additional features. So if you wanted, for instance, to have as an additional CD ROM in your computer system, you are able to do that by removing the lid that covers the expansion bay right there, and then you insert your additional device that you want to do from the side, and then it will appear here at the top as possibly a DVD writer or a CD drive, a ROM or anything like that. We also have expansion slots at the back. So in the event where you're looking to expand, perhaps have a graphics card, especially people who are into gaming and things like that, they like to expand their functionality on their system by including additional expansion cards, and you'd use then those expansion slots to then expose the back of the different expansion cards that you are including in your system. We then have our power supply. So we indicated when we started that the motherboard is the central place in terms of making sure that things are communicating with each other. But things are not able to communicate with each other on a system if there's no power. So the power supply also then becomes key in terms of making sure that it powers everything that's running on a system. However, the power supply is also dependent on the motherboard to feed power to all the different slots and the different items that you have. So a power supply will have a long connector that sits on the motherboard for powering the entire system, so turning it off and on and making sure that there's power to the different parts of the computer. In the event where you are expanding the different slots, then you will use these small connectors to provide power from the expansion slot to the motherboard, and that's how communication then happens. What we have also on the motherboard now are the different expansion slots. So these slots, they house different expansion cards, right? So we've got different types, and I think in most parts, the AGP card, which is the video, is indicated in brown, and the other PCI slots, which would be your network cards, your sound cards, and things like that, will be in a almost cream white color. You will see that there's PCI Express, and PCI Express times 16. The functionality in most instances is the same. It's just that the PCI, it would be the older standard, and then if you have the PCI Express, will be sort of the latest standard. And as the standards improve, and the standards will in most cases improve from a speed perspective. So where the upgrade of a particular PCI card or a sound card, then you realize that the communication link is a much faster communication link as compared to the PCI. So that's why then you'll have some motherboards will just have the PCI 1 or 2 of the same PCI. Some of them will have the PCI and the PCI Express. So they differ. As technology progresses, they try to keep as much of the previous standard within the current, but also looking at improving the capabilities of a device. Now, when we're talking about expansion cards, we're talking about cards that are housed within the expansion slots. So what we put in these slots are these cards here. And generally, these cards provide additional functionality on a system. And sometimes where a system that comes standard with a graphic card and the graphic card gets damaged, then you, instead of replacing the entire motherboard, what you do is you get yourself a new graphic card, you put it inside in one of the slots, the AGP slot, and then you power it up. And then after powering it up, then it will then again provide a graphics provision for your system. A lot of people who use these expansion cards are people who are into gaming. You will see that in most instances, especially the AGP cards or the graphics cards, will also carry a fan on them, because gaming requires a lot of intense memory usage, and it's quite busy in how it works. Then the system almost produces a lot or too much heat coming from the graphics card itself and everything else that's functioning, be it the processor or the hard drive. Then it creates, the system creates a lot of heat. Then those PCIs, the graphic cards will then come with a fan on them, just to make sure that there's enough cooling within the system. What you also find inside a system is that you find what we call a PATA and Sata cables. And basically what these are cables that will connect your expansion or your additional, in fact, not just the additional, they connect your hard drives, your drives, your hard drives, your DVD, if you have a DVD-ROM, if you have anything that sits on the expansion slot and you want it to be connected, then it will use this PATA or a Sata cable to connect from the back of the DVD drive onto the motherboard. So this here will clip onto the device itself. In fact, this here on the device itself, and the other part will clip on the motherboard. What used to happen back then is that sometimes you wanted to connect two hard drives on your system. Then what you would do is you would connect this part onto the motherboard, and then you'd connect your main hard drive on here, and then you create what we call a slave drive, and you connect it here as a secondary hard drive. So when you power on your system, then you are able to see two different hard drives on your computer. This is now years ago. Over time, you will see that we now use the SATA connector, and it doesn't slave or it doesn't have the primary or slave sort of separation. What you do is you connect it, and then you can create your drives within the software. But basically, this used parallel communication, which was slower compared to what we are using now, which is the serial advanced technology. So basically, this here speaks to the speed of transmission. And the serial type of communication comes in three different, so there's three different SATA connectors, and the SATA 1 is the older version, and the latest I like to think is the 3, and the 3 is backward compatible to the 2 and 1. So when you have the 3 on your system, you are able to connect it to a connector on your system that used a 2 or a 1. There would be a difference in terms of speed when you connect it to the lower type of, or the older types of standards, but basically the 3 is backward compatible. So if you have a system that uses SATA and you are looking to change the cable for some reason, maybe the hard drive that you're trying to connect is not reading the SATA connector for some reason, then you get a new one. You are able to get a 3 if a 1 and a 2 are not available. Right, and then the other part, I'm sorry you can't see this properly, I'm only seeing it now, but the other part is the the heat sink and the thermal paste. So in most cases, this is also used on a lot of gaming or intense or computers that are intensely used in terms of processing. Then you get a heat sink which regulates the computer temperature. And what it does, because it's got the thermal paste as you paste it on the bottom of the heat sink, as you lay it on the computer, it sort of gets rid of all the air that could have traveled in between the computer or the motherboard and the heatsink itself. So it attaches it directly, and then there's no air that comes in, that goes in between, and any type of heat that that is generated around, say, your processor, if you have the heatsink on top of the processor, then it converts that air into a fluid type of substance. You wouldn't see it, but it helps with regulating the system temperature. And then, like I was saying, the thermal paste then eliminates any heat that may be trapped in between, because the amount of heat that is created by especially gaming boards can actually burn the motherboard. So where you have a heat sink in place, and you've got the thermal paste there, then all the heat that's created is then converted into a sort of liquid substance, and then the cooling within the system becomes better. What we also have on the system is the Cmos battery, which is responsible for the BIOS, and the BIOS is the basic input-output system. And basically, your BIOS is going to be your ordinary battery. And the main function of the BIOS and maybe the Cmos is to start the computer after it's been powered. So you press your power button, and then the Cmos takes over and makes sure that everything that's required for the system to start is in place and is powered up. It's also responsible for keeping our time on our computers. So sometimes you see that your computer has got, every time you switch it on, you almost have to update the time. More or less, chances are your Cmos battery is actually dying. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pause, and we're going to see if we've got any questions from the bits that we've just demonstrated before we move on to the second part of the presentation. Zods, were there any questions? Did we have any questions in the chat box?
There's nothing so far on our chat box.
Great stuff. Just remember to make sure that you complete the attendance register. Also remember to make sure that you pin me on your screen, especially if you are, in fact, if you are using both your laptop, your tablet, or your computer. Just make sure that you pin my screen firstly, and that you have your screen on rotation, so that you have a landscape view, so that you see everything that we are going to be going through at this moment. Right, so I take it that we do not have any questions, so we're going to now move on to the second part of today's presentation. Please remember that all the parts that you are seeing are not just components that you find on just an ordinary desktop, right? We find the same components in our laptops as well, and it's just the difference will be in the size. The difference will be in the size of the different parts, but basically everything that we've touched on, you will find on a laptop as well. Right, so what we're going to do is we're going to try and show you all the different parts within the system. So please bear with me as I am going to try and zoom and make sure that we speak and see all the parts that we were talking about. Right. Let me try zoom deeper because I think we need to see all the elements that we were speaking about. And I almost have to be a teacher and show you all the different parts using a stick, a wooden stick. So you will see that right here at the center of the box, we've got what we spoke about, the motherboard. And you will see that the motherboard is stationed right on the one side there. Can you confirm that the screen is now visible?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much, Quinn. So you will see right here in the center of this computer box is what we call the motherboard, right? And it's stationed right in the center of the casing, right? So what you do is the first thing when you have an empty case is you will then insert a motherboard that you've bought, and then the screws on all the sides of the casing, you will screw the motherboard onto the casing. Okay? Then your casing in most instances will come standard with a power supply. And the power supply will have all these cables that are on it, right? And what you will have is that you will have this main power plug. Now, I know that you may not see this perfectly, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a power supply that we've taken apart, and then I'm going to bring it on the side so that we see all the different parts on it. Right. So you'll see that this here, this beautiful tool here, sorry, I'm not looking at the right camera. This bit here is the bit that will connect onto the motherboard. And you will see that our motherboard, let me just remove this expansion slot. You will see that the motherboard has got a slot here for the power supply. So all you do is then you clip this part of the motherboard. You clip this part of the motherboard onto the board itself, and that provides power onto all the bits that you have on your system. Just take it down a bit so you see. I'm going to try and clip this thing on, and you will see that the power has got a little clip on the side. And when you look at the motherboard, it's also got a little clip on it. So what you do is that your orientation of your power supply is in the same direction as that clip. And what you do is that you snip it on. It will create a clipping sound. Sorry, that clipping sound didn't go. There we go. I hope you heard it. It will clip on, and basically this power supply then sits at the back of your computer like this, and then your power supply moves from here onto your main power on the wall, and then that's how you would have connected power onto your system. And then what sits here, sorry, I'm moving from all sorts of directions. Please bear with me. Right. So what sits right opposite the power supply will be the expansion bays that we were talking about. And within these expansion bays, you will see that on the side, there are screws here, just to make sure that the bays, or rather the different the different hard drives or the different parts that you want to include within your system are set in place. And when you insert the additional, say, hard drive or the additional DVD writer, is you insert it from the back like that, and then it slides through, and then your view of it will be, I'm just hoping you'll be able to see it. Your view of it will obviously be the DVD writer that you are used to, but from the internal bit, you insert it from the back, and then you place it in position, and then you screw on the different parts. So different cases come with a different number of expansion bays. So when you buy your casing, it will depend obviously on what you are looking to achieve with your system. And then the hard drive. The hard drive in this instance is situated right there at the back. I'm hoping you can see it, but if you can't see it, it's still okay because I'll demonstrate. Let's move towards the bottom. Right, so the hard drive is sitting right there at the bottom, and it's also mounted almost to the casing. However, in some instances, you are able to find a hard drive sitting in one of the smaller expansion bays. So you will have the bigger ones that will host your DVDs, your DVD drives, and your CD drives and things like that. And then you will have the smaller expansion here. And when you look at the front, in most cases, these smaller expansions, they are closed off. But what sits here will, in most cases, be your hard drive. In the event where, it's not mounted to the. Just try and move it up a bit so that you are able to see the entire. Yeah, so it will be housed right here, right below the DVD or the CD expansion base. It will be housed here, and in most cases it will be closed off because it doesn't have a face that has functionality like your DVD drive. So it will be hidden, but the inside part of it will then be sitting right here, and then you'll have obviously your screws to make sure that we're holding it in place. And in the event where you wanted to expand and you wanted to have 2 hard drives in your system, like I was explaining earlier, then you will have that one sitting there, and then you can still insert another one here, hold it in place, and then use your Sata cable, because in this system we're using our Sata. Then you have your Sata, you have your Sata cable, right? This cable that looks like this, that will then be clipped onto the motherboard to make sure that there's communication between that different hard drive and the motherboard. You will then need a connector like this to power. Let's just remember to move back. Then you will need a power connector. Because this connector is already connected onto the system through the main connector which is sitting on the motherboard, then this power connector you then connect onto the hard drive that you've newly installed, and then that means your hard drive is good to go. I'm just looking for a example of a hard drive that we can show you. All right, we've got one here. Unfortunately, we've got one that's also open. Right, let's just move back. Right, so what we have here is what you would know as a hard drive. And the one that you know wouldn't actually be showing this face, but I think it's great that we've got one like this. So what sits inside a hard drive is that we have this this almost CD that sits here, and it's of a glass type of material. And every time you are seeking for information on a hard drive, this little spindle moves around the hard drive, finding that piece of information. And it moves and it moves and it moves, and then it finds the bit of information that you're looking for, and then it brings it back to you. Now, what happens in most cases is that when you drop your laptop or when you drop your system for some reason, or it bangs, then this part here gets scratched or gets damaged. If that happens, it means this thing here dies. And in most instances, we've seen ourselves having to replace the hard drive. And in most cases, it's because we have killed this glass piece here. It works almost like how a CD would be playing on a CD player. And right here at the back, we've got the connectors, the connection that requires a PATA. In this instance, you will see that this is an older standard, and it requires then that you have your PATA connector. If you remember, I said it's the parallel connector, and you will see that it's got a little notch right here at the end, and the connector on the hard drive itself also has a bit of a notch to indicate that that's how it's meant to clip. And what you do is then you slide it in, right? And then you don't force it. It will slide in, and then it will be in place. And then what you do is you have your PATA connector that will connect onto the motherboard. Let's try move onto the motherboard. That motherboard has got a Sata. So let me try and demonstrate with the one on my desk. Right. So the PATA will then connect to a PATA connector on the motherboard. And you remember not to, my PATA connectors have bent. So this here will connect onto, rather this here, I'm hoping you can see it, there, will connect onto the motherboard. It's also got a bit of a notch to indicate that, this is how you position it, and then you click it on. I can't click this one in particular on because the little pins are on the motherboard here. You will see that each part on the motherboard, just unlock that quickly. Sorry about that. All right. So you'll see that each part on the motherboard here has got little pins on them. And what happens in most cases is when you force any sort of part to go on, these little pins sort of bend. And if they bend, it means that you therefore can't attach any of the parts using the different connectors on. And that's exactly what has happened here. And then it means the functionality of that particular slot is actually damaged. Right. What we also have, let's go back to our system case. Right. What we also have on our system case is that we've got our heatsink here. If you remember when we spoke about the heatsink and that its role is to make sure that it reduces the amount of heat that's in the system, and then it will regulate the heat, change the heat into a liquid type of consistency to make sure that the airflow here is much cooler. And you'll see that there's multiple fans that sit here. And that basically is an indication that, a system, as it works, it produces a lot of heat and it needs to be constantly cooled down. Now, behind this fan sits there's a heat sink. In fact, this is a heat sink and fan. And below that is what we call our processor. And when we started, we looked at the processor. Now, a processor will look like this if it's unbent. The one that I have for demonstration has got a lot of pins that are damaged. But it will look like something like this, and you will see that behind it, or where you are meant to bed it onto the motherboard, it's got quite a number of pins. And then on the motherboard, you will have a slot that looks like this, right? You'll have a slot that looks like this, and in most instances, it will have a lever that extends like this. And what you do, and like I've shown you, my processor here has been bent. But what you do is, when you look at the processor, in most instances, it will have an indication here at the top, indicating that the side needs to face a particular direction. So you follow that indication, and then you make sure that you place your little pins according to what is indicated there, and then you close it in so that it sits in there nicely, and chances are it will click on to indicate that your processor is in place. And then on top of the processor then will sit your heat sink and your fan like this, to make sure, because remember, the processor makes sure that all communication that runs within within the motherboard, so everything connects to the processor and is communicating with the processor. So it uses quite a lot of power. It produces a lot of heat, and as a result, you will end up having to have a heat sink on top of it and a fan. With some systems, you find that the heat sink at the bottom is not there, but it's got a fan, a very heavy fan, that will blow the heat away from the actual CPU. Sometimes you will have an additional heat sink that looks quite different from the ones that I've just demonstrated. Let me just demo this one. And it comes in a different sort of color. And you find these mostly where people, sorry, my thing just fell off. You find these mostly where people are gamers, and because they are gamers, their systems produce a lot of heat. You will realize that firstly, where the processor sits here, and then it's bolted down. Then you have your fan that just sits on top of the processor like that, and then you have another heat sink right next to it here, to make sure that any heat that's produced and maybe fanned towards the direction of the other parts is then cooled down, and the entire system actually functions better because of the heat sink that's in place. Remember, the other element issue that is caused by a system having a lot of heat is that it can slow it down. So as far as possible, we try to make sure that our systems are actually have enough air flowing in them, and that there is sort of enough air circulation, and that the system does not suffer. The other part, I think we've touched on the hard drive. We've spoken about the heat sinks. This one here as well is a heat sink. And then this is the fan, the CPU sitting at the back. What we have here where there are blue slots is your memory. Now I'm going to try and unlock that memory bit because I don't have an additional memory piece on my desk. So I'm going to unclip. And you will see that when I unclip a memory, it will have two white hinges on the side. What you do is you just pull back the hinges, and then you touch your memory card where there is just the plastic parts, like we mentioned earlier. That it's important to make sure that when you handle your memory or any part of the system for that matter, you touch the plastic parts and you don't touch any of the metal parts that sit here at the bottom. Because if you for some reason carry any static electric that sits with you, and you touch these contacts, the metal contacts, it means that this entire piece is broken, and it does cost quite a bit to replace. Now we have different memory types. There's the DDR1, DDR2, DDR3. With time, there's always progress, and the main thing around the changes is also speed. With the latest standard, you'll find that the speed for the memory is quite fast. And in most cases, you will realize that the memory slots, there's more than one memory slot, meaning if you buy a system and it's got maybe one DDR and you're really looking to expand the memory, then you are able to sort of expand the speed by having an additional memory card inserted within these slots. So you'll see that this one here has got 4 of them, and so you're able to expand so that it's fast. But you must remember that when you are upgrading your memory, it's got to be in line with what the processor can take. Because having more memory and the processor can't take, then it means you just have wasted money. So make sure that your processor can take the amount of speed or RAM size, so that you get maximum functionality from your system. And how do we insert our memory slots? You will see once again. Our memory slots also have some form of almost like a cleft right in the center. And what you do is you hold this on the plastic sides, you put it on the memory slot, and then you clip it on, and you make sure that you pull back the levers on the sides. So I'm going to try and put it back, and hopefully you will be able to see, because I'm using the system as it's standing. So we're going to try and push that back. Let's try and push it back. So remember, you hold back the plastic bits. You look where the hinge is situated, and then you slip it in. Slip it in, it will set in, and you remember just to make sure that your hinges at the end are clicking onto the memory. You'll see there will be a clicking sound, which indicates that the memory is in place. What we also spoke about earlier in the presentation is the element around the Cmos battery. Let's try find the Cmos battery on this. Let me just quickly see where the Cmos battery is situated. There it is. Right. The Cmos battery, you will see, is situated right there at the center, and you are able to replace this battery anytime you realize that your system is finding it difficult to start, or when you realize that the time on your system for some reason does not seem to be picking up every time you connect to your system, then in that case, chances are that your Cmos battery has died and you can replace this anytime. But I must say the Cmos battery lasts for quite some time, so it's not something that you will change on a regular basis, but it does help to know that when your system loses time, and it struggles with booting up or starting up, you sort of know that's the indication that your Cmos battery could have died. Now, what we're going to have a look at is we'll have a look at the back of our case, and the back of our case you will see that it's got all the PS2 functionality that we like. Let me just move it so that we are able to see all the parts. Fine. Now you will see from the back that we've got at the back, this fan here is our power supply fan. Then we've got our power point where we plug onto the wall socket. And then when you move down a bit, you will see that there's additional expansion slots. So where you're looking to add some functionality on your system, you've got slots available there. And then when you move to the bottom, you will see that it's got some space for a fan yet again. So this was quite a good system in terms of processing. And then we see that here on the side, we've got all our PS2 connectors. So this would, sorry, I'm looking at the wrong connectors. Okay, so this is what's hiding the PS2 connectors. Right, we've got our PS2 connectors right here at the bottom. We've got our jack connectors. We've got our DVI connectors. DVI is graphics. So where a person is looking to intensify in terms of graphics, then they use the DVI connector. Also the VGA connector, which is also graphic. We've got then our USB connectors. Then we've got our Ethernet for our RJ45 connector. So this will be your internet connection. So we know in the system you are possible to connect to the internet. And then we've got our usual jacks for the sound, for the audio, for your headsets and the likes. Now, what happens is in some instances you realize that actually you want to become a gamer and you would like to expand functionality in the system. Then what you do is you buy a card. You buy a card like this. A card that would potentially have a it will have your DVI connectors, see, right here at the back, like we just indicated on the case. And you will see that it's got a fan, a big fan right at the top, to make sure that your graphics card, this then is your graphics card, is secure in terms of the amount of air that's blown away from it. And how you would use this is that on your motherboard, you've got expansion slots. I don't have them on this one. Oh, you've got your expansion slots. Let me just move and use this one on my desk. You've got your expansion slots, and like you would see here, the expansion card will have your metal pieces here, and it will have almost like a cleft as well. And these clefts are just an indication of how the card will go onto your expansion slots. And then your expansion slots, I'm trying to see if I can find one that's got the latest expansion so that I can include it here. Right. So I can't seem to find one that can house this one, but I'll show you quickly how they clip on. So where at the back of your motherboard, you don't have a DVI connector, for instance, right? What you do is you then buy this type of DVI card, and then you will have expansion slots on the motherboard that look like this, or like this, or like this. Most instances when it's graphics, it will be like this. And what happens is that you then, this one won't click on this one because the slot isn't for this type of connector. But what you do is that you just click the expansion, the card onto the expansion slot, and you realize that, yeah, you click it on, and then what you realize is that then your system has got additional functionality, and then the functionality will show at the back of the computer system, where all the other, at the back of the computer system, where, oh, sorry, no. At the back of your computer system, where all the other slots are showing. So in essence, these slots that we saw, the DVI slots, would then appear here after you've inserted the expansion slot, or rather the expansion card, sorry, onto the expansion slot, which is on the motherboard. What I have here as well to show you is that, like I was saying, all the parts that we have on a computer, on a normal desktop type of computer, we also have in our laptop, on our laptops. You will see that this is a hard drive from a laptop, right? You will see that it also got connectors. These were PATA connectors, and you just use the connector to place the connector here, the PATA connector here, and then you use the other end to connect onto a laptop. I have got a laptop that was torn apart to sort of demonstrate and I'm hoping that we'll be able to see it. Right, so that's a laptop screen. And you will see that within the laptop screen, how one would dismantle it is you dismantle the top part, which is where the keyboard sits. So you'll see the keyboard sits on top of all the other parts that are housed within a laptop. And then you'll see that the motherboard in a laptop stretches right across the laptop from one side to the other, and then is placed right at the bottom of the laptop. Yeah, it's placed right at the bottom of the laptop like that, and all the different parts will then sit yeah. So this here is the motherboard that sits within a laptop, and the back here is what will be mounted at the back of our laptops, and then you will see that it's got the different pins, the different pins, the different expansion bays. This is where your hard drive would be sitting. Where's my hard drive now? I had it now. So this is what would be sitting right here. And it would sit and click on there, obviously using the SATA connector. Sorry. Yeah, so the hard drive will be sitting here and it will click on there, and then there's expansion bays there. So basically everything that sits on a that sits on a tower or your desktop is exactly the same on your laptop. However, in terms of expansion, because a laptop has limited space, the expansion options are quite limited. Right. I was saying the expansion parts are quite limited. So I think that's the end of the demonstration. We looked at the different parts that are found within a computer. We've looked at how you can click the different parts from onto the motherboard. We've looked at how we keep our computers cooled down because it's important, and where we feel that our computers produce too much heat, and then we reduce the heat by including a heat sink where possible, or avoiding to have multiple applications running. And I think that part would belong to section 2 of the help desk session. Zotumo, I don't know if there are. I think the one thing that I forgot to mention is the fact that in order for everything to function as we see it on a computer, it needs communication in the form of software. In most instances, as a basic, it would be your operating system. And secondly, it would be the applications, the different applications that we use. And then they communicate with the different parts using a language, the different programming languages. And the language is basically zeros and ones that are sent in parallel or in series to the different components of the computer. And then there's feedback, because there's feedback from the hardware, because the zeros and one in series or in parallel are the language that the different components understand. So, yeah. Are there any questions on the ground?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Masapelo. I'm really excited to be part of this session. It's so amazing to actually see this being done virtually. Well done. Right. My question here is about the pins when they when they bend. Now, what do you need to do? Do you need to replace the part, or is there anyhow that you can repair the part whereby the pins are bent?
Okay, so thanks for that question. I think it's a very important question. It will need me to do a bit of a demonstration on my side. So let me just find quickly a motherboard. So you'll see that a motherboard has got parts that have got pins that are rising, right? And everything that's mounted onto the motherboard, if it breaks, it affects the entire thing. So if a pin bends, if you've got maybe a power a power connector on the motherboard and there's only one power connector, for instance, right? You'll see that this one has got two. If you've got just the one power connector and the pins bend to such an extent that maybe one falls off, it means that your motherboard is damaged. Where it bends and one breaks off and you've got two power points, then you are able to use the alternative power point. So then your motherboard is safe and there's nothing, that you can, you need to buy. However, if a processor, for instance, where's my little processor? If your processor, like the one I had not so long ago, give me a sec so that I find my processor. Now it's disappeared. It's really disappeared. If my processor, for instance, you will realize that the processor at the end of it has got little pins. And they call how we call them is that if your system has got a processor and it's not mounted onto the motherboard, I think they stopped doing those ages ago. But sometimes you'd get a processor that's mounted and it would have pins. If those burned, then it means your motherboard is dead. However, of late they make them like this one, where it's detachable. You will see that this one has got broken pins everywhere, so it's really damaged. No one can use this anymore. In that case, you are able to dismount it from the motherboard, right? Because it sits here. You are able to dismount it from the motherboard so that you get the same processor, replace it, and put it back onto the motherboard. So what's key here is that you guard the motherboard with your heart, because it's the heart of the system. If anything gets damaged on this space in terms of pins bending and whatnot, it means you're losing functionality of that particular part. If it's an extended bit, like a processor that can get attached, and the pin breaks or bends, then it means you need to replace that part, which is a much cheaper exercise than replacing the entire motherboard. In fact, if you're replacing the entire motherboard, when you considering using the very same components, you'll have to get the same motherboard or a similar motherboard or a more advanced but same type, so that all the other components are compatible with the motherboard. So with computers, everything needs to be compatible with everything. I think what standard becomes the hard drive, the expansion slot. So your hard drive, your DVD, your CD drives, your power supply. But when it comes to your memory, your processor, your graphics, also your graphic cards, you'll realize that they are very different and they differ in their functionality. Then you'll have to consider those elements when replacing, and you are looking to replace with the same motherboard and using the same parts. So yeah, the key is not to bend anything. And the only way not to bend anything is by making sure that you do not force parts onto a system. If you place it on, it should click on, and then it will have a leash that holds it in place. Then you just pull that back. If you try to put it on and it doesn't fit, it means that it's not for that system. What we call it the male and the female parts. On the motherboard, it will have holes. For instance, with your processor, you will see that the little dots that hold the processor in place, those are called female, right? And as soon as it's got a pins, it's called the male. So the male goes into the female, and then it settles it, but you don't force it. The other element is that the different computer parts will have little notches that indicate how they fit onto the motherboard. So before you click it onto the motherboard, you make sure that it aligns. So you look at the notch here, you look at the notch on the motherboard. Please don't do what I just did. You don't touch this part of any component, right? You look at the notches here, and those notches will inform how you place them. If the notches here are misplaced, don't force it. All right. Do we have another question? All right, there's a question from Preacher Mweketi. Are you able to unmute, sir? I'm assuming it's a sir, and sorry if it's not a sir. Please unmute and share your question. Mr. Mweketi? I see Mr. Mweketi has unmuted, but for some reason I'm not able to hear him. Mr. Mweketi, are you able to perhaps type the comment or the question in the chat box? And then perhaps in that case we'll be able to assist each other. In the meantime, is there anyone else with a question or a comment? Whilst people think about it, I think I didn't show you. Let me open. Okay, we've opened your hand, Mr. Mweketi. Can you try unmuting again? Right, whilst we're resolving that issue, I think I didn't show the other type of card that we also have. So this would be your network card, NIC card, very old standard, but you would see that if you had an expansion slot, PCI slot, you'd slot this in into the PC, and then at the back, you would be able to connect to the internet using your internet PCI, your NIC card, your network interface card. I think most systems now come with those embedded on the system, so you don't have to expand. But even if you've got an old system, you are able to expand different parts. So where your system didn't come with your jack ports, audio parts, then you are able to buy a card that just has the audio parts. Or if the audio parts in your original system fail for some reason, the ones that are embedded on the motherboard, you are able to buy a card, insert it in the slot, and you have functionality for your microphone and your audio. Right. Mr. Mweketi doesn't seem to be winning, but I'm hoping that he's typing the question or the comment in the chat box, so that we try to resolve the concern or the comment before we close the session, if there aren't additional questions. Any questions, comments before we end the session? Was it too much to take in? Or did it not make sense? Do you need me to explain something else again? Okay, so we've got the comment from Mr. Mweketi, and he says, thanks. All this looks complicated, but the information is invaluable. And what about the external hard drives? Will you recommend their use? Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, and I know it can be overwhelming. What we've just gone through is actually what most students will undergo over a period of 6 months in depth, looking at the different parts and their functionality. So this is really generally an overview. So it can get quite complex, I agree. But once you play around, it gets better. So it will get better. External hard drives, the idea behind them is the same, right? So they use very similar technology to your hard drives that are internal. The only difference is that obviously when you connect them onto your system, you connect them externally. Remember, your hard drive houses this is now your internal hard drive. It houses the operating system, which helps with the booting of your computer, right? In the event where you are looking to use an external hard drive, it is great to use for storing data offsite. So where you have documents, videos, music, movies, and things like that, that you want to keep and store in a separate place, that it works well for. But when we're looking at the functionality of a computer, you still will need an internal hard drive because it houses everything that needs to boot a system. So we can't replace an internal hard drive with a hard drive that's running inside a computer box. That would be the difference in terms of the two. But in terms of storing data and things like that, the concept is the same. And the other thing now, it's quite complex. The other thing now is that with cloud computing, there's been ongoing conversations about the benefits of using cloud storage over your physical hard drive. Like I said, this is very sensitive, and if it's the same concept that sits that is used for an external hard drive. So in the event you drop your external hard drive and it's got all your videos, all the information that you want to keep, then you're in trouble because this thing cracks, it scratches, and then you can't retrieve your data. Whereas on your cloud computing, you are able to store everything and there's no fear of dropping it or scratching it or anything like that. The other end of that is that there are all sorts of security reasons around cloud computing. How safe is my data? Can I trust that, no one will try and steal the information that I have there and things like that? So they all have their advantages and disadvantages. Same story with USBs. They do them now in much bigger sizes. But the challenge with USBs obviously is that they are prone to getting viruses because they move from one system to the next, and they collect viruses. Then your data or information gets corrupted along the way. So it's a tricky question that you're asking, actually. But I personally like external hard drives if you're going to be careful with them and take care of them. But cloud computing seems to be the way forward. So if you are looking at storing moving forward, your cloud, you should consider storing things on the cloud as well. All right. I am not seeing any other questions or comments. And if that's the case, I would like to thank you for joining this afternoon session. We really appreciate that you've joined us today. And we are looking forward to having session 2 of these sessions. And we really hoping that we will be learning and growing together. Thank you for joining once again.